The US Central Intelligence Agency Director William Burns met with his Russian counterpart, the head of the Russian intelligence agency SVR, last week. This was a secret meeting that happened in Ankara, Turkey. Now, while there were no talks of any kind of negotiations, which could lead to a peace deal or a ceasefire of some sort, we are led to believe by the American side that this was simply to reiterate that any use of nuclear weapons by Russia would be crossing a red line, a line that would be unacceptable to both the United States and its European partners. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed to the Russian news agencies that indeed a US-Russia meeting had taken place in the Turkish capital, but he declined to give any further details. In fact, William Burns was meeting Sergei Narishkin, who is the head of Russia's SVR Foreign Intelligence Service. It was the first known high-level face-to-face US-Russia contact since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of this year. US officials were going out of their way to stress that Burns is not conducting any negotiations of any kind. He's not discussing settlement of the war in Ukraine. Burns, in fact, is a former US ambassador to Russia who was sent to Moscow in late 2021 by President Joe Biden to caution Vladimir Putin about the troop buildup in Ukraine. But could the United States be exploring the possibility of peace? Is there wariness among the American public for this ongoing war? For President Biden, who has seen from very close quarters how the American people were bogged down by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, could Ukraine and the fear of Ukraine becoming the next Vietnam drive an impetus for peace? And most importantly, is the American taxpayer worried about the billions of dollars that are being spent on Ukraine through military and non-military aid? There have been no publicly acknowledged meetings between US and Russian leaders since before the invasion, although there have been some direct phone conversations. The last known face-to-face interaction was when Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, met with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. This happened in January in Geneva before the war began. Last week, speculation emerged that some senior White House advisors would prefer to see an end to the fighting. Now, the speculation was driven in large part because of General Mark Milley, the US top military officer, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying publicly that he believes Ukraine had fought the Russian military to a standstill and there were possibilities for some diplomatic solutions. During internal conversations about the war in Ukraine, America's top general, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, in recent weeks had led to a strong push to seek a diplomatic solution as he believes the fighting is headed towards a lull. But Milley's position is not widely backed by President Joe Biden's national security team, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Neither of these two men believe now is the time to make a serious push for talks over Ukraine. In comments at the Economic Club of New York last week, General Milley praised the Ukrainian army for fighting Russia into a stalemate, but he said that an outright military victory is out of reach. This is exactly what he said, and I quote, "When there's an opportunity to negotiate, when peace can be achieved, seize it. Seize the moment." But General Milley's boss, US President Joe Biden, echoed a slightly different thought. Biden insists that the US will continue to provide all the capability for the Ukrainian army to defend itself. And he went on to say that America right now is not engaging in any negotiation. He said, "There's nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's a decision that Ukraine has to make." That's what Joe Biden said when he was asked about this on the sidelines of the G20 last week. Biden was speaking after he met with China's President Xi Jinping, who's been a key ally and a supporter of Vladimir Putin and his war on Ukraine. The fact that Biden took this line right after meeting Xi Jinping was not lost on anyone. But sooner than later, questions will start getting asked about this seeming blank check that America has cut Ukraine. The US just last week agreed to send another $37 billion of military aid to Ukraine. That takes the total amount of money that's been spent on Ukraine since January of 2021 close to $100 billion US. Now, several Republican members of Congress are escalating calls for a forensic audit of US military aid to Ukraine. But is an audit of all that aid, which includes not just cash transfers, but loans, military equipment, humanitarian supplies, is that even possible? Now, to begin with, we need an answer to a very simple question. How much money has the US government sent to Ukraine since this war began? The Congressional Research Service, which is a nonpartisan in-house think tank of the US Congress, it produced a report recently on the total security assistance as of October 2022. Funding in that category of security assistance from 2014 to October of 2022 was just $20 billion. But this points up another complicating factor. Different sources measure buckets of aid very differently. Some talk about security assistance, some talk about military assistance, some talk about humanitarian aid. There are very few comprehensive figures of the total amount of money that America has spent on Ukraine. The closest figure comes from a database run by the Kiel Institute, which is a German think tank. They have been tracking the total military and non-military aid to Ukraine since the beginning of this conflict. Now, according to Kiel, the US has transferred military and non-military aid worth $54 billion to the government of Ukraine. The database that Kiel has maintained is by far the most granular and detailed account of what the US government has provided to Ukraine. Kiel's estimated $54 billion plus the White House's new request for another $37 billion would bring the total cost of US involvement in Ukraine to a little over $91 billion US. Now, let's put that $91 billion into context. The European Union members countries, which is about 20 plus of them, and their various institutions have provided about $30 billion to Ukraine since this war began. The Jamestown Foundation estimates that Russia's most recent annual defense spending was $77 billion. So the amount of funding that the United States has given to Ukraine just in the last 9 months of this war is a good 30% more than even the annual defense budget of Russia. President Biden knows that now, with the Republicans controlling the House of Representatives, there is going to be an end to this blank check. After all, the American people have been fed up of 20 years of war, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The last thing that Biden wants to do is to turn Ukraine into another Vietnam. The sooner there is a peace deal, the better it is, not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for the rest of the world. And Biden knows this better than anyone else.